Okay, so let's talk about which iPad to choose. Number one, let's begin with the no's. No, do not use an original iPad. No chance whatsoever they'll work. Hasn't worked on any aviation app in 5 or 6 years. Also, if you have what's called an iPad 2 or an original iPad mini or an iPad 3 or even an iPad 4, please don't buy those. The iPad 2 came out something like 6 years ago, more than that. The original iPad mini was a fantastic device, but it was simply a shrunken version of the iPad 2. So though it came out a year or two after the iPad 2, the original mini had the same electronics inside as the iPad 2. So neither an iPad 2 nor an original iPad mini have the horsepower to run anything close to the current version of the Apple operating system. They're stuck at running version 9.35, I believe, and the current version is 13. So that gives you a good sense of just how old these iPads are. Unfortunately, FlyQ will not run on these devices, not at all. In fact, you're going to find that the vast majority of applications, certainly anything as big and complex as an aviation app, will not run on an iPad. Just as a sense of measurement here, ForeFlight discontinued support for the iPad 2 and the original iPad mini more than a year before we did. So it just won't work. Do not pick up a friend. Don't, if a friend wants to give you an iPad 2 or his old iPad mini, just say thank you very much. That's very kind of you, but I can't use it. So what you can use though is Apple sells a large number of current models. We've been reviewing that, of course, in preparation for this presentation. All of the current models are great. And if you want to save a little bit of money, although we won't talk about the prices here, you may not know this, but Apple actually has essentially a refurbished store where they take iPads, iPhones, Macs, whatever it may be, and they refurbish them up to the original factory specs. In fact, in most cases, it's extremely difficult to tell it's not new. They put shrink wrap around it, you get a box, all that kind of stuff. They don't, in keeping, well, the problem with that, of course, is that they do such a good job refurbishing it that the price that they take isn't massively cheaper. It's on the order of 10 to 20%. So it's a nice discount on iPad. Whether it makes a difference is up to you. But do be aware that all the prices that I show you today are based on brand new current models. Now, iPads come in a lot of different variations. There are a lot of different ways to look at iPads, different models, different sizes, um, things like that. In general, though, from a diagonal screen size perspective, they come in anywhere from a 7.9 inch to 12.9 inch screen. And as I say, size does matter. But in this case, the size is simply, do you get the right size device for the plane or for the pilot? What I mean by that is if you get, let's say that you fly a Mooney. A Mooney, of course, has a notoriously small cockpit. So if you try to put a large iPad, like one with a 12.9 inch screen in it, obviously you can fit the iPad, but you may not have a whole lot of room to maneuver around it. And you may have a lot of trouble finding a place in the cockpit where it doesn't block something or get in the way of your knees or something like that. On the other hand, a 12.9 inch screen will give you nice big text. This is what I mean by plane versus pilot. A 12.9 inch iPad may not fit in your plane, but if you're hypothetically a 52-year-old guy who wears reading glasses, or maybe even a little bit older, you may find that that 12.9 inch display is a whole lot easier to read than a display on an iPad mini at 7.9 inches. So what's right for the plane may not be right for the pilot. What's right for the pilot may not be right for the plane. Keep that in mind. One other thing to keep in mind is I'm going to show you 5 different iPad models or describe them to you. 2 of them are what Apple calls their Pro models. The Pro models are not really all that different in most ways than one of the iPad Airs, as I'll describe in a little bit. The only real material difference that I could find, honestly, was the ability to use a newer version of the pointing device that Apple calls an Apple Pencil, which would usually be called like a screen pen. It lets you write on the screen. The iPad Pros can also use a standard USB-C connector, while all of the other iPads use the standard iPad connector that they've used for the past 5 years or so. None of those two probably don't make any difference to you. What does possibly make a little bit of a difference is that the Pro models do have a slightly brighter screen. I'll give you the numbers on that in a little bit. I don't think it's really that material, but it may be, and that one's up to you. The other way that iPads are generally categorized, so there's size, there's model type, and then a big one really is they sell iPads for all models. They come in either Wi-Fi only or Wi-Fi plus cellular. Well, what does that mean? Well, Wi-Fi, of course, means that you connect it to the internet by bringing it near a Wi-Fi hotspot of some sort. Your home, your office, possibly using your phone as a hotspot if you need to, at a Starbucks, whatever it may be. But it cannot talk on the internet like a phone can because it doesn't have a cellular chip. The other type of iPad, broad categorization, is they have Wi-Fi plus a cellular chip. Now, what's interesting about that one, and that those models consistently cost about $125 more than the Wi-Fi only ones. First, you have to understand that a little bit unlike cell phones, or at least the way that cell phones used to be, just because you buy an iPad that has a cellular chip does not mean that you have to buy some kind of an annual plan or even a monthly plan. It's totally optional. What you're really going for here is having the chip inside it. And why is that relevant? Because as the second point shows, only the Wi-Fi plus cellular version, which means to say the cellular chip, has a built-in GPS. You can certainly use, and in fact, I'm going to recommend for most people that they buy one that doesn't have Wi-Fi plus cellular, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But if you do plan on using the iPad in kind of a standalone fashion, it's extraordinarily useful to have one which does have the Wi-Fi plus cellular. Also, I would point out that in terms of data plans, things have changed since the good old days. Back in the old days, if you got a device, you had to buy an expensive data plan for it. Not so anymore. As you probably know, most of us, many of us anyway, have a number of devices attached to our, whether it's AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint, whatever it may be plan. You can usually put multiple devices for a family on there for almost the same price. Same thing applies to an iPad. If you buy an iPad that has Wi-Fi plus cellular, typically you spend about, if totally optional, if you want to connect that iPad to the internet cellular wise, it's usually about 10 bucks extra a month to your plan. Whether or not that's significant to you is of course up to you. But just know that even if you buy the Wi-Fi plus cellular, you don't have to get a data plan, but if you do, it's probably not all that expensive. Something that I think a lot of people don't quite understand is there's a concept in an iPad of storage space, and that's what's quoted all the time as 16 gigabyte storage, 32, 64, 128, 256, things like that. That's not the same thing as RAM. RAM, if you think back to the old days of having real computers, PCs and Macs, they had a storage device, typically, again, in the old days, a spinning drive, more commonly today, a solid state drive, but it was something to do mass storage when the device was turned off. Then it had RAM in it, and RAM is memory which only works while the computer is actually on, and it's blazingly fast, much, much, much faster than storage RAM, than storage space from either a spinning drive or from a solid state drive. That's what's used to run your programs. Apple, for whatever reason, always quotes the amount of storage space that a particular iPad has. They never ever tell you, at least not in any easy to discover fashion, they don't tell you how much RAM it has. The reason why that's relevant is because in a lot of cases here, the reason why the older iPads don't work is not because the CPUs are slower. You could argue, well, maybe it's a little bit slow, but it'll be fine. No, the real reason is because in a lot of these older iPads, the big problem is they don't have enough RAM. If they had more RAM, by not having enough RAM, it means that running the operating system itself, let alone a relatively large application like FlyQ EFB, is simply too much for the little guy. What ends up happening is that Apple's operating system is really draconian in terms of killing applications itself if it thinks that the application is using too much memory to ensure overall a positive experience for the user. In other words, they don't want it to get too bogged down, they don't want it to get too slow and so on, so they'd rather just kill the app. That's fine, I suppose, from Apple's perspective, but if you try to run a big application on an older iPad, it simply runs out of juice. It runs out of RAM, and the application will seemingly crash, which means disappear and so on. It's not a problem with the application. It simply means that the application is just too big for the iPad to run effectively. So that's the big thing going on with storage. So then the obvious question, of course, is how much storage do you need? Well, it turns out that virtually every iPad that Apple currently sells begins at 64 gigabytes. or some of them, I think one of them begins at 32. Back in the old days, they had started at 16 gigabytes, which is definitely not enough to do anything. 32 gigabytes is what we consider to be absolutely marginal. That's enough space to download FlyQ, to download all the data for the entire country, but not use the iPad really for anything else. You'd be struggling for space. So we really do recommend that in the current day and age, you get an iPad that has at least 64. Now, iPads now, as show you here, show you on the next slide, come in a lot more memory than that, if you, a lot more storage if you need it, and that's fine. But just for using an aviation app or even two, you don't need mega amounts of memory. You also do have a choice, of course, in color. Now, you probably think that's silly. Oh, who cares? If it's black or white, or actually, no, pink is usually another color. You may wonder, well, why does that really matter? And the answer is it doesn't that much, but it does matter a little bit. If you tend to fly, for example, in the daylight, you'll find that the darker iPads that have a dark face to them may absorb a little bit more heat than the white iPads. So if you get either the rose color iPad or the white iPad, I think they call it silver, the face on it, the plastic on the front is white, which you could argue is probably slightly more reflective towards heat. On the other hand, if you're flying at night, you might also counter argue that you want one that has a black face on it so that any little bit of light in the cockpit isn't going to reflect off the iPad and into your eye and potentially hinder your night vision. So the choice of black or white or rose is pretty much up to you, but there may be some very slight differences if you fly in extreme heat or you fly a lot at night. Okay, so now we get to the part about which iPad to buy. So if you go to the Apple website, and I can do that to you a little bit later in the presentation, they basically have 5 different iPads that are current models. 2 of them, the ones on the left, are what they call the Pro model. One in the middle, the iPad Air, is kind of, you could call maybe the JV model, is kind of the in-between model. The one that's simply called the iPad, while it was in development, it was typically called the education iPad because it's frankly not a bad iPad, but its specs are quite a bit different actually, quite a bit lower than all the other iPads here. And then surprisingly, the iPad mini is not the least powerful, nor is it the least expensive. Rather, the iPad mini is actually the same guts in it, essentially, that's in the iPad Air. So you can basically get an iPad Air or an iPad mini with essentially the same electronics. It's just a matter of what size you want. Okay, so let's talk about what the differences actually are. On the iPad Pro side, you do have one which is 12.9 inch. We internally call that one the Jumbotron. That one, unless you're flying a 747 or above, is probably not going to fit in your cockpit too easily. It is really big. The 11-inch iPad Pro is not so bad. It's a little bit bigger than its neighbor there, the iPad Air. The iPad Air is 10.5 inches. Again, remember that these are diagonal measurements. However, it turns out if you look at them, the physical size of the devices look about the same, and there's a reason for that. It's because as it happens, the iPad Pro, if you look very closely at it, has a bigger screen, but less space around the screen, what's called the bezel. So if you look at the iPad Air, you see a touch sensor at the bottom, and you see the camera on the top, and you see a fair amount of space kind of wasted at the top and the bottom. The iPad Pro 11-inch looks like it's just about the same physical size as the iPad Air. You just get a little bit more screen in the same physical space. The iPad next to it is also just about the same size, and I think actually has a slightly bigger bezel, a little bit more wasted space than the iPad Air. But all 3 of those devices, the iPad Pro 11-inch, the iPad Air, and just the iPad, are all about the same size in terms of physical size. The iPad mini, of course, is noticeably smaller. It's more like, just to help you visualize it, it's more like the size of an approach plate or a paperback book, something like that. While the mainline, say 10 to 11-inch iPads are more like a hardcover book or something like that. And then the iPad Pro is more like a notepad, or frankly, if you have I'm actually running this presentation on an iPad MacBook Air, and the MacBook Air has a 13-inch screen. So the screen on my iPad is about the same size as the screen on my MacBook. I'll give you a sense of it. Okay, so we still get into which one do you want to get? Well, um, The next line down there talks about screen coatings, nits, and the CPU. The first thing to look at is the CPU. The CPU is that little square thing. As you can see, the iPad Pro 12-inch, 11-inch, and iPad Air all have a variation of the A12 processor. That's pretty much the newest thing that they make. The iPad Pro has a 12X, which is a little bit faster, but in the same general ballpark. You do see, though, that the iPad next to it has only an A10 processor, which, as the name may imply, means it's about 2 generations or at least 2 years old. As a case in point, when you take a look at the iPad later today and actually look at what the screens look like, I'll be running it on my own iPad. My own iPad that I'm running this on is also just plain an iPad, but it's actually a little bit older than the one here. And yet the processor in it, I believe, is an A9 processor, and it's about a 3-year-old iPad. So the CPU that's in just plain iPad is by far the lowest bang for your buck on any of these. The iPad mini next to it, you'll notice, has the same A12 processor as the iPad Air has. So again, power-wise, the new iPad mini and the new iPad Air are pretty much the same horsepower. They also, the non-pro versions of the iPads have a screen that is measured, it's something called nits, for brightness. It's 500 nits. That's pretty bright. That's brighter than most laptop screens. But the iPad Pro actually has a 20% brighter screen. It's 600 nits in both the iPad Pro 11-inch and the 12.9-inch. 20% more. How visible is that going to be to you? I don't know. If you already have an iPad, and I suspect most of you do, and you're just upgrading from it, if the screen that you have now is adequate, the new ones will be even more than adequate. If you find that the screen that you have on your older iPad may not be bright enough, then you may want to consider the iPad Pro with its 600 nit screen. One other thing that's relevant here to flying an airplane, if you have an iPad, again, like the one I'm looking at, most of the older ones have a relatively glossy screen. It makes them look prettier, makes the colors look a little sharper sometimes. They look nice indoors, but they tend to reflect a lot more. So when used outdoors, like flying an airplane, they tend to be a little bit problematic, and people will often get like a little film that you put over it that makes it somewhat anti-reflective. Turns out, though, that all the iPads on this list, except for the normal iPad, as it were, already have the anti-reflective coating built into it. So again, the difference between an iPad Pro and an iPad Air is not gigantic. Let's just put it that way. But the gap between an iPad Air and a standard iPad is pretty large. Of course, if you want a smaller device, you only have one choice, and that's the iPad mini. And you know what? It's a really good iPad, so you're not going to mind the choice. Below there, I have the prices for all of these things. So let's begin from the cheapest one. The cheapest one is not, as you might expect, the iPad mini. The cheapest one is actually the iPad in the middle, the normal iPad with the older A10 processor. That's probably for the very simple reason, of course, that it's the oldest design. It's a couple-year-old design. Below there, below all the prices, oh, okay. So that one's $329. The mini next to it is $399. And these are the starting prices for them. The iPad Air, which is probably the first of the full-size iPads that we'd really recommend, that one is, at least for a lot of people, that'd be $499. And then the iPad Pros begin at $800. The iPad Pro 13-inch is $1,000. And if you look down the bottom, the 12.9-inch iPad Pro goes up to a pretty astonishing $1,700 if you want to put the cellular chip in it and a frankly crazy amount of storage at 1 terabyte. I don't think really anybody except for maybe a hardcore graphic artist or somebody would ever get that device, but it's available. So basically, iPads cover a huge amount of price difference. They begin at $329 and end at $1,700. Pretty big gap. So now the question, of course, is, well, gosh, that's a lot of models and a lot of different things. Which one should I get? Well, before I get into that, and I'll get to that in just a moment, if you take a look at the prices, you'll see that there's two different sets of prices. One on top that's Wi-Fi only, and one on the bottom, which are the ones that say Wi-Fi plus cellular. So all the ones on the bottom have cellular, all the ones on the top don't. Now, what I've done here is I've basically circled all the ones that have the amount of storage that I think is reasonably good. So It's a little bit misleading because the Pro versions actually do, their base model is 64 gigabytes. I didn't circle those, although I do circle 64 gigabytes for the older iPad, for the smaller iPads, simply because if you're going to pay $1,000 to buy an iPad anyway, what the heck? You might as well get a lot more storage. And that one jumps from 64 to 256. There's no 128. I don't think really any normal human being is going to need more than 128 gigs of storage. But Apple conveniently doesn't make a model like that on the iPad Pros. So if you're going to spend that kind of money, you should probably upgrade the storage a little bit too. But if you're on the more economically priced models, I would actually recommend that you really don't need that much storage, and you should probably go with just a 64 gigs. That's more than enough for FlyQ and some other app and lots of movies and lots of other things. Plenty of videos and photos and all that good stuff. On the iPad normal one, the one with the A10 processor, you notice though that I didn't circle a 64 gigabyte model. I circled the 128. Why? Frankly, because they don't make one. They don't make a 64. The one that's covered over by the blue line, unfortunately, so you can't see it, is 32 gigabytes. So the normal base iPad comes in 32 and 128. 32 does work for FlyQ, but I would simply not do that if I were you. Uh, the longevity of a 32 gigabyte system is a lot briefer than something that has a bit more space on it. So in that case, we do have to recommend that you get a little bit more memory. So let's go on to maybe some of our recommendations on. First thing you may notice that there's no blue circles next to the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. This is, again, personal preference. We're certainly not telling you what you should get. There's a lot of variations in the kind of things that people need or that people like. But if you're strictly using this for use in the cockpit, or even mostly for use in the cockpit and maybe some other things, I personally can't think of a lot of reasons why you'd want a 12.9-inch display in the cockpit, especially because you'd probably outfit it to be about $1,200, maybe more if you get one with cellular. The other thing you'll notice is that I didn't circle any devices that have Wi-Fi plus cellular. Now, why? In fact, my iPad actually does have Wi-Fi plus cellular, and I would be very annoyed to have one that didn't. I'm not necessarily normal though. I do a lot of traveling with it. I do a lot of presentations with it. I use it for a lot of things that, to be honest with you, don't necessarily have anything to do with aviation as well as aviation. So for me, the flexibility in having one that has Wi-Fi built in, that has cellular built in, is pretty high, and it was worth an extra $100 or so. Also, I do find that it's more convenient. Again, when at trade shows or doing demos, it's usually a lot better for me to have one that has a GPS chip in it, just for normal use. Now, the first question that may be running through your mind is, whoa, wait a second, why would I get an iPad that doesn't have a GPS? Well, the reason for that is I would very strongly suggest to you that the GPS that's built into an iPad or into an iPhone, while it can work in a pinch, and for many people it works in more than a pinch, it works pretty well. I would really recommend, given that this is November 2019, pairing an iPad with an ADS-B receiver, and virtually every ADS-B receiver has a GPS built into it, and the GPS that's built into it is a much better GPS than the GPS that's built into an iPad. Therefore, if spending a little extra money to get the flexibility of cellular and the GPS is worth it to you, like it is to me, by all means, spend an extra $100 or so. However, if you want to be economical about it, you really don't need it. You really can get away just fine with a Wi-Fi based iPad, so long as you also pair it either with a Bluetooth GPS, which are about $100, or if you pair it with an ADS-B receiver, which could be anywhere from about $200 to about $800 for a top of the line one. So I would strongly recommend, if you don't already have an ADS-B receiver, get a Wi-Fi based iPad to save money, and then get an ADS-B receiver with a GPS. So again, then the question becomes, which one do you want? So it's pretty simple. If you want a smaller iPad, you really only have one choice. Get the iPad mini, probably get the 64 gigabyte model. If you want, get it with cellular for an extra $130 if you want, but 64 gigs should be plenty for aviation. I would not recommend getting the original iPad that's frankly a lot like the one that I use. That doesn't mean it won't work. you can trust me, since it's my iPad, that FlyQ EFB is definitely designed to work on an iPad of that class. In fact, the iPad here for $329 is slightly more powerful than the one that I'm using today. And the one that I'm using today runs FlyQ very, very, very well indeed. The reason why I don't recommend buying that is because the price difference to move up to either an iPad Air isn't really all that high. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you take, I'm going to move back to the last slide for a second. If you take a look at the normal base iPad, I recommended that you don't get the 32 gigabyte configuration because it's too small. So we recommend in the normal iPad column, I circled the 128 gigabyte model. That's at $429 because you have to pay a little extra for the storage space. Compare that to the one just to the left of it, which is the iPad Air, which, although it's less storage, only 64 gigabytes, it's only $70 more. And what you get for that $70 is a lot. You get a much, much newer CPU, the A12 as opposed to the A10, and you get the anti-reflective coating built into it, which will make the screen easier to use. To me, the storage space is irrelevant, but the fact that you get a CPU that will last years longer in terms of Apple operating system upgrades and the anti-reflective screen, that's a pretty big deal. So I definitely think that if you're going for the mainstream type iPad, if you want it, I'm going to go on to the next slide now. If you want to get a relatively economical device, I would go for the iPad Air, the 10.5-inch model, and I'd probably get the base model there, which is $499. It's a really good iPad for $500. On the other hand, if you absolutely want to get something with a better screen brightness and a slightly more modern processor, it's a pretty big step up. It's another $300, but you can move up to the iPad Pro 11-inch for $800. Whether or not that's a good value is entirely your call. For me, that seems like an awful lot of money for awfully small amount of difference, a little bit brighter screen. But hey, if you fly in Phoenix, if you fly in an open cockpit, if you fly in a glass cockpit, you may find that having the slightly brighter screen is helpful to you, or not. If you fly in Seattle, well, as you probably know, it never gets sunny here, so who cares? So just save some money. Hopefully that helps you a little bit in terms of which iPad to get. Now, at this point, let's talk about some of the things that you also want to get along with your iPad. So let's talk about some accessories. As I've already mentioned, if you don't already have one, please do get an ADS-B receiver, or it's called ADS-BN. We do not recommend that you get a Garmin device, only because Garmin devices only work with Garmin software, while virtually every other ADS-B brand out there works just fine with everything from FlyQ to ForeFlight to WingX to things on the Android, whatever. Your investment in hardware is a lot safer in the case of ADS-B to get non-Garmin. We also say, unfortunately, we wouldn't recommend the old Stratus 1 or the Stratus 2 or the Stratus 2S. They're excellent devices, especially the 2 and the 2S. However, they were hard-coded to work only with ForeFlight. So you essentially have the same problem that you do buying Garmin, is that you can only use those Stratus models with ForeFlight, which is kind of a problem if you want to use FlyQ, or frankly, if you even want to use anything else. So we really don't recommend, even if you can get one at a bargain price, don't get an iPad, don't get a Stratus 2 or a 2S. However, we do recommend the Stratus 3, which is a fantastic device in every way, and also works on FlyQ and ForeFlight, and about everything else out there as well. That's kind of the top of the line system. A little bit below that is the what's called the Level AstroLink. You may not have heard of that. It's relatively new, but it's about $100 cheaper than the Stratus. It's also a very well made device, made by like Stratus. It's made by an American company. These folks are based, the Level people are based in Florida, so you know the thing works in heat. Has an excellent AHRS. So if AHRS is your main thing, the Level is probably a good way to go. And then if you want to save some money and get a really, really good device for about $350 or $320, go with the Dynon DRX. The Dynon DRX is a really, really good ADS-B receiver. And all of these, by the way, have a built-in GPS. It's a really good ADS-B receiver. All of these are dual channel. They work on receiving 978 data from the ground. That's the weather and the traffic. And the 1090 data that you get, which is only broadcast air to air and is traffic only. The Dynon DRX is the lowest price of the group, is an excellent device. The only downside to it is it doesn't include an AHRS. It's just ADS-B and GPS, but at about half the price as the other units. If you just want to go with the GPS, probably because you bought a Wi-Fi only iPad, the Garmin works great there because it's not specific to Garmin hardware. It works with anything that hooks to an iPad, or the dual 170 types, sorry, the 160 or the 150 unit. Case. We definitely suggest in terms of accessories, you get a case. Now, this one's kind of up to you. If you want to get a case that looks like it's military grade and would survive World War III, or running over it with your car or your airplane, feel free to get some big case that is super, super heavy and super strong. I personally don't like that. I don't like my iPad to weigh more than a laptop, but if you want to do that, feel free. The reason though why we do suggest a case is simply the one that I use is the kind of Apple one, which is just a cover. It simply flips over and it covers it up, covers the screen up. I find that to be useful because it does a reasonably good job protecting the screen, adds little to no weight, and it will turn the iPad automatically on and off because of a little magnet inside it. They're also relatively inexpensive, don't weigh a lot, and so on. So personally, I like that, but there's a wide variety of cases that you can get, from military grade to things with designer labels on it. Mount. Well, this one is one of those religious debates almost. A lot of people, myself included, actually do not mount the iPad in the cockpit. I find that when I'm flying an airplane, I like to focus on flying the airplane. So I'm not looking at the iPad constantly. I'm looking at the iPad frequently to look up information, double check position, things like that, but I'm not constantly staring at it. I fly VFR, by the way. So for me, just simply putting the iPad on the passenger seat is totally fine. I pick it up every once in a while, I look at it, I put it back down again. I'm not constantly looking at it. If you are using it as a primary navigation device, be advised that's not necessarily legal, depending on what you're doing. You can fly IFR looking at a georeference position on an iPad, for example. But if you want to look at it a lot, an mount that goes on your yoke, if you have a yoke, is a good way to go. To me, the downside to put on the yoke is kind of obvious. When you turn the yoke, you turn the iPad, and I find that to be annoying. It also, depending on how long your legs are, putting something on the yoke, especially if it's a normal size iPad, not a mini, is very likely to either not fit or to seriously get in the way of your legs. So a yoke mount is unlikely to work for a lot of people, depending on the plane. If you have like a 206 or something, maybe. But if you're flying a little Piper, a Cessna, or a Mooney, something like that, it won't work. And of course, if you have a plane that has a stick, not a yoke, you obviously can't get a yoke mount. The other type of mount that you can get, though, is to go with something that sticks somewhere on the dash, potentially covering over instruments that haven't been used since there was AM radio was high tech. That's a way that a lot of people go. You can also get mounts that come off the floor in some cases and have like just a really long neck to them that hang off. So there's a lot of different ways that you can mount an iPad. Whether or not you use one is entirely up to you. I personally don't find it necessary, but an awful lot of people do. So that's probably a good one to ask your friends and buddies and look at their planes, especially people have the same plane that you do, and see what they're doing. A charger. Well, an iPad isn't bad. An iPad will probably run anywhere from, if you have full screen brightness up, which you may need in some cases, it will run anywhere from, let's say, 4 hours to maybe 6 or 7 hours, depending on how you use it. For most of us, that's probably long enough. But if you don't want to take any chances, you should probably have a charger in the airplane. In fact, given today's electronics, it's probably not a bad idea just to get a charger in your plane for whatever, whether you want to charge your cell phone, you're flying with your kids or your spouse, and you want them to be able to charge their phone while you fly, or if you want to charge your iPad or GPS or power an EDSB receiver, all of that stuff, having a good solid USB charger in the plane is a good idea. We do not recommend that you go to Amazon and pick the cheapest thing you can buy that fits into a cigarette lighter. A couple of reasons. One is that from a lot of aircraft, you're running off a funny number of volts, so it's simply not going to work. Keep in mind that anything for a car is based on what is it, 14, I may get the voltage wrong here, I'm sorry, I'm not an electronics person. But whatever the voltage is in the car, it's not the same voltage that you get in a lot of airplanes. So you'll end up frying your receiver, rather frying your charger if you get the wrong voltage. So we don't recommend you do that. You probably want to talk to somebody like My Go Flight or Sporties or Guardian, somebody like that, and they're going to be more expensive, but get a charger that really works for the aircraft. But don't get me wrong, if your plane does have normal car voltage, you may be able to get away with a normal price car thing. But even in that case, we found that electrical interference is a big issue. Of course, if you can pick up something for 20 bucks, it may not be a bad idea to just try it, see how it works in the plane. When it doesn't work, you return it and buy something more expensive. In some cases, it may well work on the less expensive things, but you really can never go wrong buying an aviation grade part for flying an airplane. It's just kind of that simple. Battery pack. Just in case all hell breaks loose, not a bad idea to pick up a $30 or $20 battery pack to plug into your device to charge it. You may find that you never need it, but given its low price, very small footprint, and general utility, you can use it to power a phone, to power an iPad, to charge a GPS, whatever. Probably a good idea to have a spare backpack with you. Doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be a $200 battery pack, just something relatively inexpensive. Preferably something that can pack enough amps in it to charge an iPad. iPads take more power than an iPhone. That's why if you take a look at, if you have both an iPhone and an iPad, if you look at the charging brick that comes with them, the brick that comes with an iPhone is a little tiny square the size of, not that much bigger than say, a really big die or a very, very large sugar cube. While the charger rather, that comes with an iPad is more of a rectangular thing, has a little bit of heft to it. And that's because an iPad has a bigger battery and it needs more oomph to charge it because it draws more power. So if you do get a battery pack, make sure that the battery pack is rated for iPads as well as an iPhone. Not all that hard to do. Then the ultimate accessory for your iPad is an iPhone. I'm not just saying that because this is like an Apple ad, but because FlyQ and frankly, most other pieces of software too, run on an iPhone as well as an iPad. So your ultimate backup in case of your iPad failing because you forgot the charger failed, you stepped on it, you ran the airplane over it. Yes, I know people who've done that. Something like that. It's always useful to have a backup on your phone, to have a backup for a backup of a backup, whatever. So let's talk a little bit about iPad settings. I'm going to show you these on the iPhone, on my iPad rather, after we talk about them. So by general settings, I mean things that you set up once and then you never worry about them again. If you are using either an iPad that is specific to the an iPad GPS that's built into your iPad, or you're using a Bluetooth GPS, the way that it actually works is there's something called location services, which is a function of the iPad operating system. There, basically, you plug in a GPS, again, like a Garmin or a Dual, and that GPS location goes through the operating system. Then the operating system uses what they call location services to broadcast it to apps like FlyQ that need it. In that case, it's required that you have location services turned on and I'll show you this, that the location services are on specifically for FlyQ as well. Normally, that's not a problem. When you run FlyQ for the first time, the operating system will actually prompt you to allow your location to be used by FlyQ. If you say yes, all is good. If you're just flicking past it and you're very, very worried about security and you said no, you will find rather, that the internal GPS or an external GPS like a Garmin will not show location on your iPad until you turn location services on and on specifically for FlyQ. Another one is it's really a good idea, and I'll show you how to do this, and it's changed a little bit in iOS 13, to automatically have the iPad update your apps. Now, that one may be a little bit controversial. I would probably argue that in the case of aviation apps, I haven't seen any case, at least not in years anyway, where an update to an aviation app has really caused any serious problems for people. Sometimes a new version will have little bugs, but they're usually relatively small, and usually they are massively outweighed by all the bugs that were fixed in that release or the new or the features that were added. And I'm really careful to say auto update for apps. It is a totally different story to automatically update the operating system when Apple updates the OS. That one I would strongly advise against. Turns out that I think when you install iOS 13 for the first time or you're buying a new iPad, the application updates I think are on now automatically, although you can turn them off, but the operating system updates is a separate switch and is turned off by default, and that's where it should stay. The other thing is, in the event that you have the application updates turned off and you get a notice from Apple saying, hey, you're about to fly a plane, you're going to fly in an hour, and you see an update that, version number 13.3.6.8 or whatever is now available, do you want to update? The correct answer there is no. Do not update just before you fly. Check first with the manufacturer of all the software that you use, especially anything that's critical to you, like an aviation app, to make sure that they don't have any problems with it. Most of the time in current systems, there's not any big deals usually. There's sometimes some minor cosmetic problems, but back in the day, maybe a few years ago, there were issues where Apple, disabled accidentally location services for a lot of Bluetooth GPS devices. So for, I think this is iOS 8 or something, during that release, there was about a 3-month period where no external GPS, at least made by Dual or some other vendors, would work on an iPad. And Apple simply was in no hurry to fix it. Okay, the other part is setting, well, I'll tell you what, let's go back and talk about these. So I'm going to back this up, leave that on the screen. Making a mess. Okay, now I'm going to switch this over to the iPad, and I'll show you what this is really like to use it, some of those changes. So excuse me while I rearrange my screen a little bit. You don't know it, but I have 2 screens right now. So I'm looking at the slide presentation on my secondary screen. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the settings app on the iPad. The settings app is a Gear iPad. It by default is on your home screen. So I'm going to tap on that. Okay, so inside here, this is the general settings thing. So inside settings, the first thing I said to look for is to make sure the location services is on. Apple has a tendency to change this occasionally, its location, but currently it's way down here in the privacy category. Why they put in privacy, I kind of get it, because giving your location to an application is a privacy violation you could add, but unless you're a computer geek, that probably wouldn't be obvious, nonetheless. So you tap on the blue button down there that says privacy, and you notice it has a lot of things. It talks about privacy for location services, the thing we're interested in, contacts, calendars, reminders, Bluetooth, microphone, blah, 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 camera, goes on and on. But the main thing here is that you want to make sure that location services, as you see here, is turned to on. Then you notice that there's an arrow next to it. That means there's more stuff. So I'm going to tap on location services, and I've got a lot of apps here on my phone made by a lot of different companies. Some of them have to do with aviation, some don't. But the one that's relevant here is down there around the middle of the screen next to the word privacy is a magenta icon that says FlyQ EFB. It says while using. You notice that it also has a little arrow next to it. The arrow next to it means that it is currently using the GPS, and that's of course because we are currently using FlyQ EFB. In the event that I'm going to tap on the while using part, if that had been set to never, that would mean that if you had a Bluetooth-based GPS or an internal GPS to the iPad, it simply wouldn't be able to tell where the heck you were. Because although the location services were generally on, it meant that it wasn't working properly when connecting to FlyQ. So make sure that's set to while using app. Notice also that unlike a lot of different applications, let me see if I can find one like this. Maybe they changed this. But previously, there was a setting on there called always allow access, and maybe Facebook is set like that. Yeah, of course. So Facebook, its location services are set to have a fourth choice, not just never, ask next time, or while using the app, but always. Always, for a lot of reasons, from a privacy perspective, is not a great idea. The main problem, though, is it always means that it's always sucking over a little bit more battery than it needs to, even when the app really isn't being used. Notice that for FlyQ, that's not even an option. We didn't think that made any sense at all. So how do we check on the auto updates? Okay, so to check on the updates to it, you take a look at your iTunes and App Store section, which is right here. And what you see is a number of things on the screen that talk about automatic downloads. Music now is turned on. Applications I turn off. Notice I actually told you that application updates should be turned on, and it should be. I turn it off for a reason which has nothing to do with most people. I turn it off because when competitors come out with new versions of their software, I like to make sure that I see the notification on my iPad and I can read what's changed in it. For the most part, that's really not necessary for most normal humans. And and by the way, in the case of FlyQ EFB in particular, when you launch a new version of FlyQ EFB, whether it's been installed manually or automatically, because you allow the automatic background update, FlyQ, the new version of EFB, will tell you what changed when inside the app. So there's no reason to read it on the App Store, it just tells you what it is. But that's actually, let me take that back. That's for app updates. The one for apps, this can be a little bit confusing. In fact, I just confused it for a moment. The one that says apps means if someone else using your iTunes account, like your iPhone maybe, or someone else in your family, anyone on the same account, if they install an app, that means that that app is automatically installed on your iPad. For any of us who have kids, that's probably not a great idea. I probably really don't want to see my daughter's apps or my son's apps appear on my iPad. So I have apps turned off. Books and audiobooks, I don't use the iPad for a lot, so it really doesn't matter if it's turned on. And as I said, my app updates are turned off. There's also a choice here about whether or not to download data, to download applications. You can kind of modify your cell phone usage so that you can turn it off if you're using cellular data. You can turn it off if it's more than a certain amount, and so on. The other thing to look at, and I'm trying to remember what this is under General. So it's looking for software updates. Now, this is an update to the Apple operating system itself. It looks like, I didn't even realize this, honestly, this was kind of an accident. I didn't even realize that there was a new version of the Apple operating system, but apparently there is. And I have my automatic updates at the bottom of that page set to off. I would very strongly recommend that you keep yours to off as well. It's just a good idea to wait and see if any problems have come up. So 2 different places to look for updates. In General, and then from General, tap Software Update to look at the automatic updates for the operating system itself. And then under iTunes Store and so on is where you set the updates for the application. 2 very different deal. Okay, so now let's go back to the other part, which is how to set up the iPad when you fly the airplane. Just before you fly, these are the things we recommend you do. We recommend that you turn on airplane mode. You're probably familiar with that. You may, though, depending on what devices you have connected, also have to connect to either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. And this has changed a little bit. With different versions of the Apple operating system, they now do things a little differently when you turn on airplane mode. For example, until very recently, when you turned on airplane mode, if you had GPS on your iPad, a built-in GPS chip, that got disabled when you went into airplane mode. That's no longer true. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. Screen brightness. This one's a little bit questionable. This depends. If you're flying again in a glass cockpit or an open cockpit and it's a really bright sunny day, you probably need to leave the screen brightness set turned up really high. If you're flying at night, you probably want the lowest. And for normal use, you often want to bring the brightness to about as low as you can handle it and still read the screen. It helps you with battery life. And you may say, well, I haven't plugged in anyway. What's the difference? The difference is we actually don't recommend that you plug in an iPad all the time. You can if you want to, but just because of the way the electronics work, if you're charging your iPad while you're using it, the iPad will get noticeably hotter. That may not be an issue, but if this were a hot day, it could cause the iPad to conceivably overheat. So the solution to that is to leave the iPad running on batteries as long as you can get away with, and then only plug it in when you have to. So it is actually still useful to try to conserve battery life, even if you have a charger built into your plane. We don't recommend that you put the iPad to sleep while you fly. You may. It's a good way to conserve power. But in the case of something like FlyQ that has a data recorder built into it, if you let it sleep for an hour during the flight, the track that you get back is going to have a big gap in it. So you don't really want to do that. Also, in case you need to look at it quickly, if you have the screen brightness turned really low, for example, it's not using a lot of power, and then you can quickly, if you want to, turn the brightness back up when you want to look at it again. Rotation lock. So in the old days, the switch on the side of an iPad would keep it from rotating. Nowadays, it's a software switch. Rotation lock basically means that if the iPad is in landscape mode and you flip it 90 degrees, it won't go into portrait or vice versa. That's important because if you just have the iPad loose in your cockpit, it's frequently sitting on the side. You grab it, you may rotate it quite inadvertently while you're using it. Or if it's on your yoke, when you make a turn, the iPad may decide to rotate. So it's usually useful to set rotation lock. That one's up to you though, and we'll show you a way around it in FlyQ. It's also not a bad idea to kill off all the other aviation apps. And we say that not because we don't like the other aviation apps. We say that because certain devices like Bluetooth devices and ADS-B devices will sometimes lock on to the way that an iPad works communicating with some of these devices will occasionally make them specific to an application. So once an application locks on to that a data stream, sometimes that data stream is not shared with other apps. As an example, a friend of mine flies with an Avidyne and he was testing out something with FlyQ against another application. And it turned out that he started the other application first. That application grabbed the ADS-B data stream and he was then complaining, hey, FlyQ is not seeing any traffic, it's not seeing any weather, what's going on? This thing's broken. No, it isn't. What happened was that the other app was totally hogging the connection. It wasn't allowing FlyQ to access it. So it's not a bad idea to kill the other apps. It also helps in terms of saving memory space, which allows the applications to run a little bit smoother. So I'm going to, so let me just do that again. Once again, I'm going to put that off to the side of the screen where you can't see it. Okay. And then, give me just a second. Move that off to the side. Then I'm going to show you what this looks like on an iPad. So the first thing I said to do is to turn on airplane mode. The way that you turn airplane mode varies a little bit by device. You can do that a few different ways. One is to swipe down from the upper, what I just did, I'll do that again. My finger went to the right side on top where like it says 100%, and I swiped kind of at a 45-degree angle towards the middle of the screen, like that. It comes up with what they call the control panel. The first block on the left side has a little airplane, a green cellular logo, a Wi-Fi logo in blue, and a Bluetooth logo conveniently in blue. So that means that I have my cellular on, my Wi-Fi is on, and my Bluetooth is on. I also turned it off. I have also do not disturb on, so if a text message or an email comes in or something, it won't show up during the presentation. A couple of things here that are kind of handy. Next to that is a brightness control. So you can make that, this doesn't affect this, when you're plugged into an external monitor, you don't see the difference, but on the LCD screen, this makes all the difference in the world. You can change the volume also. We talked about rotation lock. The rotation lock is that button next to the, it looks like a sleep icon, but that really means do not disturb. The one next to it with a padlock. Right now, I think this will work. I don't have rotation on, so I'm going to rotate my iPad. I think this will rotate on the screen. Nope. Nope, maybe it doesn't. Okay. Let's try this. One more time. Aha, okay. So with the rotation lock off, what ends up happening is you can rotate and the screen will rotate. But if you turn the lock on and then go back to an application on the screen, I just rotated my iPad 90 degrees and nothing happened. I'll rotate it back to the previous 90 degrees, still nothing happened. Okay, so the fastest way to get to most of these things is here. So that covers the ability to turn on airplane mode. And I'll show you one other detail in a second. The screen brightness and rotation lock. So let's talk about how you kill other applications. So let's say that I was using, I also ride bikes a lot. So let's say that I'm on this little indoor trainer thingy and What else do I want to run? I want to run the App Store. I want to run NBC Sports because I want to watch something on sports. Okay, so I've got all these apps running. What you do, of course, is you double tap on the home page like that, or if you're using one that has a facial recognition thing, you swipe up from the bottom. And then to get rid of them, you just flick up. So Trainer Road is a cycling app, kill it. NBC, kill it. Settings, kill it. App Store, kill it. Just swipe up. And now when you begin FlyQ, FlyQ has all the available memory space, and there's no chance of it sucking a data connection that another app is using. So that's handy. So let's talk about the one that's a little tricky is the airplane mode thing. So I'm going to hit my settings. I'm going to turn airplane mode on like this. Does that work? Okay, I had to think for a second if I was going to kill the connection with the iPad, with my Mac, but I'm okay. So when I turn on airplane mode, it will sometimes turn Wi-Fi off and sometimes leave it on. I haven't quite figured out the logic behind this, but it usually leaves Bluetooth on. Bluetooth on is handy because, of course, if you're in airplane mode, many people today fly with, if you're really on a commercial airline, which is what airplane mode is for, many people fly with some kind of Bluetooth headphones, right? So you want to be able to talk to your headphones, so it's usually on anyway. Bluetooth doesn't really help you much if you're flying with an iPad connected to a Wi-Fi based ADS-B receiver because they're Wi-Fi based, so they don't use it. So in that case, what you want to do is you turn airplane mode on, then you tap on Wi-Fi, you turn it on, and you connect to whichever one you want to do. So in my case, it connects to my home network because I'm home right now, and so on. So at that point, the Bluetooth is on, the Wi-Fi is on. So the only thing that the airplane mode really seemed to do is it turned the cellular data off. So you could argue maybe just turn cellular data off itself, whatever. It's still just convenience to turn it on and off. The main point is don't have on more radios than you need, because the more radios you have will either just cause problems or at very least suck more battery life. So if you're flying an airplane and you're flying at 7,000 feet, there's no chance of connecting to cellular. So make sure cellular is off or it's a fairly large battery drain. If you don't have a Wi-Fi based ADS-B, don't turn on Wi-Fi. If you're not connected to a Bluetooth device, don't turn on Bluetooth, and they'll all save you power. So at that point, that's pretty much all I can tell you in terms of picking out iPads. I'm just going to put back on the screen. Let me put this back into here. This one, just so you kind of see what our choices are. So we're basically suggesting if you want a small iPad, get the $400 one, the iPad mini for $399. If you want to get a full-size iPad, it's up to you. You can buy the $500 one, which we think is a pretty good buy for the iPad Air. Should last for years and years of good service. If you want one that's absolutely top of the line, slightly faster CPU, slightly brighter screen, also has a USB-C connector, which may be useful in the future. Then you can pay $800 instead of $500. And if you really, really want a big iPad, feel free to get the Jumbotron at 12.9 inches. So that's about all I can tell you.